Hello, this is Chuck Stull, continuing our antitrust discussion looking at monopolization. Now, monopoly is at the heart of antitrust laws. Antitrust is equal to anti-monopoly. And the Sherman Act, Section 2, directly addresses monopolization. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. Now, Section 2 cases are infrequent, but they can be very important. They can have a major impact on the industry, and they can have a major impact on firms who are accused of monopolization. There are a handful of major cases of dominant firms over the last century. Standard Oil, we talked about earlier, which resulted in a breakup. In this presentation, we will look at American Tobacco and U.S. Steel. And then when we look at telecommunications, we'll talk about the AT&T case. And when we move into software and technology, we'll talk about a Microsoft case. Standard Oil, as you'll remember from our earlier section, Rockefeller had dominated the oil refining industry through very aggressive actions. There was a Section 2 antitrust case brought against Standard Oil, who was found guilty of monopolization. In the findings of that case, the court said dominance by Standard Oil was not the result of normal methods of industrial development. And that set a precedent for monopolization cases, that it's not just the size or the dominance, but also the conduct or behavior of the firm. And both of those have turned out to be important for other monopolization cases. Let me turn to American tobacco. So James Duke was a cigarette producer who formed a tobacco trust. This is the same Duke of Duke University. He was using a new technology, the Bonsack machine, that made American tobacco very efficient. It could produce many more cigarettes in an hour than other companies. But American tobacco quickly moved from internal growth to consolidation of the entire industry. Like Standard Oil, American Tobacco was very aggressive towards its rivals. It blocked them from wholesalers, it controlled supplies of leaf tobacco, and ended up buying 250 former rivals. They used aggressive pricing to get firms to sell out. They would price below cost in rivals' local markets. On at least one occasion, the price to the company after taxes was zero, which of course made it impossible for other companies, independent, smaller companies, to compete. They eventually had around 90% of the US market share in mini tobacco products and were challenged under Section 2 as a monopoly. So the American tobacco case went to the Supreme Court and was decided about 2 weeks after the Standard Oil case. American Tobacco was found guilty of a violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act, found guilty of monopolization. This was broken into 16 firms, including some major cigarette manufacturers like American Tobacco, Liggett & Myers, Lorillard, and R.J. Reynolds, and then other companies that made smaller products like snuff. So very much parallel to the Standard Oil case. Let me turn to a third case, and this one has some parallels but a different ending. So U.S. Steel was formed in 1901 through a series of mergers. So we had J.P. Morgan, financier and owner of Federal Steel, and Andrew Carnegie, who in some ways was a leader in the steel industry. Carnegie Steel used cutting-edge technology. They would run at capacity to take full advantage of economies of scale and were charging aggressively low prices. So J.P. Morgan put together the first billion-dollar company through the merger of these two steel companies and eventually wound in 180 previously independent companies. At its peak, U.S. Steel controlled about 65% of the U.S. steel and iron markets and was one of the largest firms in the world. Now, U.S. Steel did behave differently than Carnegie Steel did. The chairman of U.S. Steel was a gentleman named Judge Gary, and there were the famous Gary dinners where he argued that competitors should avoid sharp price competition. And so rather than aggressively low prices as Carnegie had in his steel company, U.S. Steel went for high and stable prices. Now, this price umbrella allowed entry, that smaller firms were able to come in because prices were held high, and the U.S. steel market share gradually declined from 65 down to 52%. U.S. Steel was still seen as dominant, and a Section 2 case was brought against it, and eventually it worked its way to the Supreme Court. And in 1920, the Supreme Court decided that U.S. Steel was not guilty of monopolization, and partly was having to get together with their competitors to try and stabilize price so that they didn't control the entire industry. Um, Also, the competitors did not complain about bad behavior or bad conduct from U.S. Steel, and the Supreme Court did find them not guilty. And this really firmly established that monopolization cases would be judged under a rule of reason standard. In other words, each case is examined on its own merits, right, and that establishing a dominant position by itself does not imply a violation, so that the courts would look both at structure and conduct. So in the U.S. Steel case, the Supreme Court said the law does not make mere size an offense or the existence of unexerted power an offense. And this was confirmed in later cases against companies like Kodak and International Harvester, who were dominant but were found not guilty. Now, there were criticisms of this rule of reason. There was a U.S. Senate committee who thought that the rule of reason was vague and would let companies get away with being monopolies who should otherwise be punished. But the rule of reason does say that there are reasons why a firm could both be dominant and not guilty of a Section 2 violation. So the court also will consider production cost and efficiency. So economies of scale make large firms more efficient, and when they exist, there's a trade-off between market power, which could enhance prices, and efficiency, which could lower cost and potentially lower prices. So firms can use that as a defense against monopolization charges. An efficiency defense, that there's economies of scale, or later network externalities, which we'll talk about towards the end of this class, are perfectly normal reasons for firms to get high market shares. Um, and so they can use as a defense that they were following sound business practices. They did not use their power to hurt competition, that they operated in a normal manner. So rule of reason means each case is judged on its individual cost and benefits in the particular industry at this time. And that means that Section 2 monopolization cases are more complex. There's a lot more information to be gathered, and they can take significantly longer. The problem is it can be a challenge to distinguish dominant firms that were created by superior efficiency from those created by anti-competitive practices. It's hard to distinguish vigorous price competition, which is good, right? Providing low prices to the consumer, with predatory pricing, prices that are designed to eliminate competition. And that's been an ongoing legal issue. How can we identify when things are legitimate? Again, to quote from the Supreme Court, the offense of monopoly under Section 2 of the Sherman Act has two elements. One, the possession of monopoly power in the relevant market, and two, the willful acquisition or maintenance of that power is distinguished from growth or development as a consequence of superior product, business acumen, or historical accident. So rule of reason complicates Section 2 cases. In recent years, we've seen politicians from Elizabeth Warren to Donald Trump calling for antitrust challenges to some of the large internet companies. But this rule of reason standard makes it very unlikely that antitrust would successfully break up a company like Facebook, Amazon, or Google. We will return to those towards the end of the class. This is Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College talking about monopolization as part of our antitrust section. Thank you for listening.